Genova Burns has been servicing corporate clients for over 35 years. John Quincy Adams said it best: whoever tells the best story wins. Here's our story. I'm Sandra Bograd, and I'm of counsel here at Genova Burns. Today we're going to be talking about regulation, or rather the aspect of deregulation and the prospect of deregulation that we are hearing about daily in the newspapers as we go into a new administration and get kicked off in a new season of business. There's an old adage that says, "May you live in interesting times." Sometimes that sounds like a good thing, and sometimes that sounds like an ominous, maybe scary thing. We are living in interesting times, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Not only are we in the United States living in the interesting times of deregulation, but economies all over the world are living in the same kind of times and taking the same kind of actions. So while we hear about it here in the United States every day, several times a day sometimes, about a new area that's being deregulated or an executive order calling for something to change in the way we do business, keep in mind that in Argentina, they've wielded a chainsaw. Those are the words of the Argentine president. They've wielded a chainsaw to regulation and red tape. In India, they're taking steps to change triplicate processes and having to sign things in triplicate to get something done and shorten the amount of time it takes to be innovative. In Britain, there are changes every day in their Department of Transportation trying to change the way they fix their airports and change their transportation systems. And even in New Zealand, there's a new anti-regulation movement. And in Vietnam, believe it or not, in Vietnam, there is a plan to shrink the bureaucracy. So it's happening all over the world. Why is that important to talk about? Well, done right, the anti-red tape is a good thing. Think about it. Should it take us 16 years to build a building in a major city? Because we have so much red tape. Without that red tape, and if we have a real reduction in red tape and bureaucratic regulation, we could foster greater, faster economic growth. Maybe there'll be lower prices, new technologies will emerge. But if we do this wrong, and we do it badly, we'll be in chaos. That's what we want to talk about today, is what are some of the questions that are emerging as we look at deregulation, what's good, maybe what's bad. How can we avoid this being, as I heard someone describe it, a Jackson Pollock painting, which is what it looks like right now. Things just thrown against the wall without real thought about how they're going to get implemented. So I think we all agree burdensome regulations should be gone, and we should move on and try to do business more cleanly, more effectively, more efficiently, and things will move faster, we'll be more innovative, we'll make more money, and we'll be better at our jobs. But as I said, think about doing this in a very specific and directed way. Otherwise, what happens? Let me suggest to you that if all of these cost-cutting and federal employee reductions and business reductions in staff occur before we change the rules and regulations, I suggest to you we may have just bought ourselves more backlog, more confusion, more time delays, because there won't be enough people to manage what are now the current regulatory requirements. When these regulations ultimately go away, that requires us as business owners and business people to create our own set of regulations, to look at our own businesses, to not rely on check the box of what the government is telling us to do. Let me give you some good examples of key deregulation in the United States that has occurred before now. Things like airline deregulation in 1978 made it easier for competition and made a marketplace where more companies can enter the airline business. So we have more choices, we have more places to go. The telecommunications deregulation, when we broke up AT&T, with expanded service availability, more people could enter the marketplace. There was more innovation, more technology, all good. Financial deregulation. 1999, there was the Glass-Steagall Act, and there was deregulation of what was then a moribund system. So finally, banks could merge with each other, and they could have insurance practices, and they could have other kinds of businesses. And energy deregulation, which allowed for the growth of all kinds of new energy and energy sources. Those were all good reasons and those were all good deregulation activities. But they suddenly became moribund, meaning that there was a place for more regulation, and regulation begat regulation. And suddenly we went from having 20,000 pages of a federal code to 180,000 pages of a federal code of regulations. So we've really gone over the top. People who make regulations like to have jobs at regulation in regulatory agencies. And so when we look at it, we think, well, maybe this isn't a bad thing to get rid of some of the extra people in government and extra people in regulatory agencies and extra work that's being done and extra triplicates. But right now we're living in a world where we just don't know what's coming next, right? We have executive order after executive order that's saying we should reduce, not only in the Trump administration, reduce not only the regulations that are on the books to relieve some of the enforcement actions that are already in place, but also to give greater power to the executive branch to be able to take over what were previously independent agencies in other administrations. So that's where we are. That's the news. Let's talk about what questions we ought to be asking ourselves for that. Do we really rely on the rules to set the framework and the governance framework for our business? Or do we do that having done a risk assessment of our own business? Do we know the culture of our business? Do we know what we do every day? Do we know, is our rule set or our governance structure based on where we do business, who we do business with, what we're hoping to achieve as a company, what our mission is, and where we're going? I think once you do that, and once you start to ask yourself those questions and create those answers for yourself within the business, you take away sort of the dissonance and the irrationality of government changing regulations. So what does that mean for the near future, and what should we be thinking about? Well, I think within your companies in the near term, what you ought to be thinking about and working with both your internal legal and compliance and governance board and control people, as well as your external providers of all of those services. I think you ought to be looking at privacy and data security. How does your company use data? What is it using? How are you managing it? Where are you sending your data? And where is it being lodged? Where is it being warehoused? The next place you ought to be thinking about is investment management. That's a changing world right now. Regulations are changing quickly around things that we thought were baked in, such as DEI requirements on your board, what were best practices. Federal government is changing fast, but federal governments all over the world are not changing fast. So, for instance, in the United States, there's a real displeasure if you have a specific DEI program in place coming from the federal government. You know, that's a new executive order to the SEC, and companies are being punished for strong DEI programs with investigations. But Canada just announced that DEI at the for securities and publicly traded companies will be very important, and they will look to see what are the DEI initiatives, what are the programs, and what's in place. Litigation is certainly going to start to pop up, whether it's because people can't meet whatever the requirements were with the contract that was formed when regulations were different, or because people are just confused about where they ought to be and how they deliver on their contracts. But the one thing I will say in closing, the real danger here could be if we continue to live in silos and we evaluate our siloed businesses by whether or not they've met some regulatory requirement that isn't actually going to be there anymore. So I would think about that, and then also think about building in additional time in the runway. If we think that these regulations are going away, and they do, but there are fewer people to impose to work at the agencies or to approve laws that have not yet been changed, make sure that you build in the additional time it's going to take to get things done as we move forward. But as I said, I'm optimistic. With the right help and the right advisors, I think we can make a stand and make sure that business not only does well, but does better than it's done in the past. Thank you.